And Secretary of State, very pleased to see you, and thank you for coming to this session on clinical incident investigation. Just by way of introduction, the reason we're doing this inquiry is because of our responsibility for PHSO, the Parliamentary and Health Service Ombudsman, who is the focal point for a wide variety of information relating to a variety of failures, including currently clinical incident investigation in the health service. It is debatable whether PHSO should have such responsibility for the forensic examination of what's gone wrong in operating theatres and hospitals. And it is hoped that this work will reduce the need for people to go to the Parliamentary and Health Service Ombudsman, who was recently pointed out to us, is set up to adjudicate rather than to investigate. And I think that was a very interesting point. And our inquiry is prompted by a paper produced in the Journal of the Royal Society of Medicine by Carl McRae and Charles Vincent. And while Carl McRae, we have appointed him to advise us on this inquiry, I want to make it absolutely clear that we're not here to champion his proposal, or we are not predetermined to support his proposal. And I want to make it clear that we may well come to a different conclusion. Can I start by asking you to confirm who you are for the record?
I can.
I'm
Jeremy Hunt, the Health Secretary. I'm feeling a bit lonely down at this end of the table, but that is perhaps what happens when you're Health Secretary.
I must also apologise. We have two illnesses and at least one other colleague speaking in a debate, so we are a little short-handed ourselves. But I'm very grateful for your agreeing to this, to make this a conversation, an open-minded conversation about this issue of clinical incident investigation. And I'm also extremely aware how much the NHS and the department is doing around this whole question of whistleblowing and complaints handling and culture change, and we're impressed by the evidence you gave us on that in this inquiry. But just to start with, just remind us, how many serious incidents are there each year in the NHS?
About 30,000 every year, of which 10,000 are severe harm or death.
And how many never events, which is when things that in theory should never happen?
Yes, I don't actually have the never events figure to hand, but I know that if you take specific examples of never events, approximately once a fortnight we put the wrong prosthesis onto someone. Once a week we operate on the wrong part of someone's body, wrong site surgery. Twice a week we leave a foreign object in someone's body. So this is much more frequent than the term never event would suggest.
So to start, the fundamental question, you say that the NHS now does seek out problems and share them with the public and take action to save lives. How well do you assess that the NHS and your department is doing this now?
I don't think that we have cracked the problem at all. I think we've started on a very long journey. I think as your investigations have uncovered, and I have discovered in the course of the last 2.5 years, in the end we shouldn't need whistleblowers, because we should actually have a culture where people want to find out that things have gone wrong and why they've gone wrong, and to learn from them. And you only have whistleblowers when you have a system which isn't doing that. And so in the end, it's about culture change and creating a climate of openness and transparency. And that's something that takes quite a long time to do. But we've put in place quite a few things that I hope will make that really happen.
We've heard that there are over 70 bodies, agencies and organisations that might investigate a medical incident. Now, ultimately, of course, you are accountable to Parliament for the safety of the health service, but who do you hold? Who is the individual that you expect to be responsible for overseeing patient safety and clinical investigations?
Well, I think the NHS is the fifth largest organisation in the world, and in truth it is an industry as much as it is a single organisation. There are 250 separate hospital trusts. As a result of the Francis review, the Francis inquiry, we set up an independent chief inspector of hospitals, and that person, Professor Sir Mike Richards, who I think you've taken evidence from, is for me the person whose job it is to be, if you like, the whistleblower in chief for the public, the person who speaks out without fear or favour if safety standards are not adequate. And he's only been in post for just over a year, but I think he really has started to do that. And we've put 20 hospitals into special measures, more than 10% of all hospitals in the NHS, primarily on safety grounds. And I think there's been a very dramatic change in the interest in the system in safety, because people recognise that if they want a good rating from Mike Richards, they have to have a good safety record. The two go together. So he's the sort of person who's, I think, the arbiter of whether there's safety, whether hospitals are run in a safe way. And then I think one of the things that I would like to discuss with you this afternoon is the stage before that, where you have something that's gone wrong, who is responsible? And I think because of the scale that we're dealing with, so we've often talked about the professionalism of the air accident investigation branch of the Department of Transport, and this morning I met David Miller and Keith Conradi to talk about how that works. But in the UK in 2013 there were 30 aviation deaths. In the NHS it's about 7,500 avoidable deaths of a total of 250,000 hospital deaths. But we don't know which the 7,500 avoidable are of the 250,000. We know some of them, but many of them we don't know. So we get that 7,500 figure from looking at 2,000 case notes and assessing that around 4% of deaths across the NHS are avoidable. So it's a bit needle in the haystack. So we couldn't replicate. But I am very impressed with the structure that they have, which means that because it's one body that looks into a number of these incidents, they then make sure that the learning from the incidents, they do about 50 serious investigations every year, but they then collect the information from those investigations and disseminate them. At the moment, the responsibility is essentially a local one, and it's the responsibility of local trusts, and then we assemble the information we get from them. We get about I think it's 1.5 million reports from hospitals every year to the National Reporting and Learning System, which Dr. Mike Durkin and his team, who we've heard evidence from, collate and assemble. But they don't
Mike
do...
Richards is in CQC,
Yeah.
Mike Durkin is in NHS
England,
and is in charge of the patient safety domain.
Yes.
When we talk about the volume of cases, we're not saying that therefore we can't expect to investigate them all. We are saying that they need to be investigated. We're just arguing about, or discussing about how they should be investigated and who should be responsible for their investigation. So the volume thing, in my mind, appears as a great obstacle to start with, but actually, if you can sort out what ones you're going to investigate, however great the volume requiring investigation, it's just a question of how they're investigated. They've all got to be investigated.
Yes, but that's, if I just unpick that, if I may, for a moment. So we have about 3,500 reports of serious incidents involving death every year, but we think there are probably 7,500 avoidable deaths. So there's 4,000 broadly that are not being reported. So they're being treated as an unavoidable death, or one of those things that...
And there's a serious incidents as well, let's just be clear.
On top of the deaths. But if you just look at the deaths, 3,500 reported into the NRLS system. we think there's 7,500 avoidable deaths. So there's under-reporting. For every one death that's reported, there's another that isn't reported that should be. So a very big priority is to create a culture where more of these mistakes are reported so that we can learn from them. And then of those that are reported, they're all investigated very thoroughly at a local level. But in the airline industry, it's very straightforward. Every single death is investigated by the Air Accident Investigation Branch, and every single death is avoidable. So in that industry, as in the nuclear industry and the oil industry, the presumption is 0 deaths. And so when there is a death, it immediately triggers a process.
But both organisations investigate far more than just deaths.
Yes, we should all investigate, because of course we need to investigate the circumstances that might lead to any kind of tragedy, indeed a death, even if it didn't. So near misses in the airline industry would be an example of that. So, so the question in my mind is, what happens in a situation? So I don't think you could have, and I don't think you would want, and this is what I try to express in our evidence for you, a system where all 3,500 of those deaths that are reported in are centrally investigated. I mean, that is a massive overhead. When you think that the Air Accident Investigation Branch is doing 50 a year.
Curiously, we were told by the aviation people that in Australia, the equivalent body, where there's a lot of crop spraying, and a routine accident is an aeroplane flying into power lines, routinely they do not investigate those accidents. So there is a way of filtering out, there must be a methodology of filtering out the accidents that are routine or are recognised hazards. I mean,
so I think that's right. But I think the nervousness we had about the straightforward replication of that model into healthcare was twofold. Firstly, it was about the volumes and how we would cope with massively more deaths, but it was also about the responsibility, because if we're going to change the culture, then at a local level a hospital needs to feel interested in what happened and want to take responsibility in finding out what happened, and should set up structures where independent investigations can be made into any avoidable harm. And we didn't want hospitals to feel that it wasn't their job.
No.
However, where I think this needs serious consideration is it's very clear, and we're going to shortly get the report on the tragedies at Morecambe Bay, where a number of babies tragically lost their lives in the maternity unit. And there are situations where there is a complete breakdown of trust between families who've been bereaved or suffered tragedies and a trust. And there are also situations where a trust might say, well, actually, we don't know if we did something wrong or not, but actually we think in this situation we want someone completely independent to look at this, who's nothing to do with our trust, just so we can reassure ourselves as well as the families that an independent investigation has been done. And so that's where I think you might have a situation where, at the invitation of a trust, if there was particular concern in a particular situation, and possibly at the invitation of the Ombudsman, you had a separate independent investigation that was done.
But just to summarise, in answer to my first question, which single person is responsible, you mentioned two names, Mike Durkin in NHS England and Sir Mike Richardson at CQC, and they're both part of the system. And CQC told us in their evidence they can't do individual investigations anyway, though I hear what you say, that he's the ultimate arbiter. So how do you ensure that safety incidents are routinely investigated?
Well, they are routinely investigated, but they're just not investigated very well all the time.
And that was another bit of evidence we've had from one of the Royal Colleges.
Yes.
The capacity to investigate locally is very patchy.
So the heart of the problem, I was very struck in my meeting. Well, let me. So Mike Durkin's responsibility is to foster and encourage a safety culture throughout the NHS by collating as much information as possible and spreading that information through the system, and he does that job superbly well. Mike Richards' job is to give an objective, independent view of the standard of safety throughout the system, and I think he does that job very well. I think any organisation that is going to be available to do independent investigations has to sit somewhere.
It does.
And that somewhere is going to be loosely part of the system. The AAIB sits in the Department for Transport. If the equivalent system sat in the Department for Health, we'd have a conflict that the Department for Transport doesn't have, which is that we run the hospitals. So the hospitals are ultimately reporting to us, and in a way that the airlines and the train operating companies aren't reporting to the Department for Transport. I happen to think that a very good place for this safety function to sit would be under Mike Durkin's operation, because I was very struck talking to the AAIB that they very much see their job as to be supportive and to foster a culture of learning and disseminate the learning that they make when things have gone wrong and to get to the truth quickly. And that seems to me to fit very squarely with Mike Durkin's responsibility to be the person who encourages safe practice throughout the entire system.
I hear that very clearly, and it would be nice to have that this organisation was also available to investigate the private sector.
Well, I think
so
it should.
There could be learning across the whole health sector.
Yes, and I think in truth, any structure we set up would be to investigate all care that was paid for by the NHS, whether it was being delivered by the private sector.
How important do you think it is to be able to investigate clinical incidents that aren't alerted by a complaint of a patient or the relative of a patient?
They should all be investigated, all instances, but the trouble is that we don't have that culture of openness and transparency in healthcare that they have developed in other industries. In the airline industry, I was incredibly struck to hear this morning that David Miller said to me that in 24 years in his job, he had never heard the word cover-up once. They have not had a public inquiry into an airline crash since 1973. And if you start to pull up the bonnet, the way they do the investigations is designed to create a blame-free culture where they're co-opting pilots into helping them understand why things went wrong in a way that doesn't penalise or make the pilot feel that it was the pilot's fault. So even the phrase human factors, if you think about it, is a way of saying to a pilot, well, if the reason this accident happened, you forgot check 23 and check 24 are the 50 checks you should do before the jumbo jet takes off. That was human factors. That slightly depersonalises it from the pilot. It's saying, well, maybe we should have made those checks 1 and 2 if they were that important, because by the time you get to 23 and 24, your memory is, perhaps slipping a bit or whatever. But, human factors, the whole methodology around human factors is designed to recognise that everyone's human beings. And I don't think we have thought nearly hard enough how that could work in medicine, and I think too many doctors, nurses, midwives think that if they are found responsible for a death or a serious incident, they'll get fired. When actually the culture we need is that if you don't tell the truth and help us to understand what happened, then you get fired, but you don't get fired for making a mistake, because that's what happens.
So at the moment, how confident are you that the present arrangements are going to bring about the universal quality of local investigations that you want to see?
That is a very, very difficult question to answer, because we should not underestimate the scale of the changes that have been made, but nor should we underestimate the scale of the challenge. Mike Richards has only inspected half the hospitals in the NHS so far. We haven't, of the 20 hospitals in special measures, we've only got 6 out. We've still got 14 that we've got to get out. we're the first country in the world that's tried to do this. All these problems we're talking about, by the way, are not unique to England. They are problems in global healthcare. In fact, compared to other healthcare systems, there is evidence that we actually may be safer than other countries. So I would hesitate I certainly wouldn't say we're there. I think we've been bolder and braver than any other country that I'm aware of, but I think there's a long way to go.
And you're introducing these new freedom to speak up guardians to try and enable whistleblowers. What role will they play in clinical incident investigation?
Well, the whole processes that we are trying to create have actually been modelled on the airline industry, which is designed to make it incredibly easy for pilots to speak up. So the first person that a pilot would tell if they had a near miss or they were worried about, that their rosters were making them work so hard they weren't getting enough sleep or whatever it is, the first person they would talk to would be their airline. But if they felt that their airline wasn't going to listen to them, they could talk to their union. If they felt that that wasn't the right where they wanted to go, they could talk to the CAA. They could also talk to an anonymous charity, which I think is run by the CAA. So there are 5 different places that they can do it. So the freedom to speak up guardians, and if you can find a snappier phrase for it, please let me know. But the freedom to speak up guardians are designed to be an independent person in a hospital.
But part of the organisation.
But part of the organisation, but just there, so that if you don't want to tell your line manager, you've got someone else you can talk to in the trust. And then the national freedom to speak up guardian or whistleblowing champion is there to check that hospitals are following procedures, so there's someone outside the hospital if you ultimately needed it.
Now, the NHS in England Never Events Task Force made a key recommendation, which was to establish an independent incident investigation panel. But we've been informed that this has not been implemented. Can you say something about that?
Well, as I understand it, it has been implemented on a pilot basis right now, and we're looking at it. And I think there may be an opportunity, because I think if you had an independent clinical investigation branch, that could be something that's very attractive to hospitals. So at the moment, when they do an independent investigation, they have to start from scratch. And in extremis, the Morecambe Bay inquiry is going to cost the best part of £1 million. The Francis report cost £13 million. These are huge costs. And actually, if you had a central resource that they could bring in when they wanted to do an independent investigation, they would pay for it, but it would be quick and probably much cheaper than anything that they themselves would do. So I think there could be some merit.
How much is the contingent liability for NHS litigation? About 18 billion, I think?
Yes, well, we spend, of my budget, 1.3 billion a year on litigation claims, 40% of which is paternity-related, incidentally.
So if we could...
There's a huge amount of money
to... If we could save a sizable fraction of that, we've got quite a lot to spend on independent investigation.
Well, I think the cost of poor care is probably... we did a study of it. It's probably around £2 billion a year in the NHS. I mean, the most expensive thing you can do in the NHS is to botch an operation. You think about the impact in terms of the time it takes to investigate it afterwards, the extra time someone will stay in hospital, the management time in looking into it. So there are huge costs that could be saved by safer practice.
Thank you. Moving on, Cheryl Gillan.
Yes, I mean, the one way to really save costs is to really learn the lessons from the investigations. And I'm very struck by the evidence that we had from the Association of Surgeons of Great Britain and Ireland, who admitted that the NHS had made great strides in the way it collects evidence of medical failing. But, and this is the big but, the big deficit, they said, is the lack of an effective mechanism through which the information gained from such reports can be used systematically to bring about change. Now, would you agree with that statement? And how on earth do you monitor the sharing of the information that comes from these investigations? And as a supplementary to that, how do you also convince the patients and the relations of loved ones that those lessons are being disseminated amongst the rest of the NHS?
Do we share the information and the learning points from these investigations as well as we should? No, we don't. That's for sure. And if you look at the scale, a system that is, up to 1,000 avoidable deaths every month, you cannot look at that and say that we're doing as well as we should in sharing the learning that could prevent so much tragedy. How can we be better at it? Well, first thing is that we have made it an absolutely core part of how hospitals are assessed to have a good safety record. So until we had the new inspection regime, basically you were a good chief executive if you hit your 4-hour target in A&E, if you hit your 18 weeks, and if you were in financial balance. All those things matter, but actually other things matter too. And so what Mike Richards does is he inspects hospitals in a rounded way with 5 domains, including responsiveness, which is your targets amongst other things, governance, clinical effectiveness, and safety is one of the key domains. So hospitals now for the first time know that if they want to get a good overall rating, like an Ofsted rating for a school, they need to take safety seriously. And I think the real answer to your question is, if I can put it this way, it's pull and push. So it's not just a question of how good Mike Durkin is at pushing out information through the system so that surgeons can see how they need to improve their procedures. It's also about the surgeons on the other end being hungry for that information as to how to improve their own performance. And so what the new inspection regime is designed to do is to try and create that hunger at the grassroots, because if the chief executive of a hospital is saying we've got to improve our safety record, and that message is going throughout the whole hospital, then inside the hospital, where they're very ambitious to get a good rating from the CQC, they will then want to improve their record.
But, I mean, what you're describing is a current culture which is very defensive. And you're talking about completely breaking that culture apart and turning it on its head. I mean, how are you going to do that?
Well, I think the way you have to do it is by supporting doctors and nurses, recognising that no one goes into work wanting to harm a patient, and recognising that doctors and surgeons in particular are some of the bravest people in the planet, because they have a human being on a table in front of them, and they're doing something that none of us have ever done, which is, taking a knife and cutting into them and doing something that is really very brave. And in that context, people make mistakes, and it's incredibly challenging emotionally to make a mistake and to know that a patient has suffered, possibly died as a result of it. So this is an incredibly brave thing for a human being to do. But because of that bravery, I think perhaps in medicine globally, not just the NHS, there's a certain camaraderie that says, if mistakes are made, we need to look out for each other. When actually what we need to do is to create... And they had that culture in the airline industry as well, which is why they had such a high accident rate. Now, they brought down deaths in aviation. They've halved deaths over the last 30 years in aviation, even though airline travel has increased 9-fold. So your chance, you now have to travel for every day for 10,000 years to have a chance of being involved in an accident, in a fatal accident in a plane. So they've had a very good track record in doing that. We need to learn that in medicine by creating a supportive culture where doctors and nurses feel that they will be supported and encouraged if they talk about worries they have about things that are going wrong, and they won't want to be blamed for it, and that actually they're part of the endeavour to learn how to do things better. It's a big thing to change. I don't want to pretend otherwise.
The one aspect of this learning from what has happened and the investigations that you haven't sort of covered is timeliness. And I think we were very struck on the committee about the death in 2001 of Wayne Jowett. I don't know whether you recall that, but it was chemotherapy drugs were injected into the spine incorrectly instead of into the vein. And I think that happened in 2001, but the final safety alert from the incident was apparently only published in 2014. Now, I have to ask the question, why did it take so long for such a fundamental recommendation from a very high-profile case to be alerted around the system and implemented? And what lessons can we learn from that? Are you going to make sure that there is a timeliness attached to the lessons that are disseminated throughout the NHS?
Well, that completely sums up everything that's wrong, the fact that it takes that long.
And I've amplified the fact that the sepsis issue.
Yeah.
We're still waiting for NICE to produce the guidance, and when they were sitting where you are now, and we were cross-examining them on the Ombudsman's report.
But if
they didn't seem to understand the urgency of getting some guidance out there to save lives.
Yes.
But I declare an interest in that because I've been in that position myself, and it was only by rapid reaction from medical staff that I'm still sitting here today, really, I believe. But we've been waiting for the results from that report, and I do hope you can do something to urge it along.
Well, we haven't waited. I mean, I launched a big sepsis campaign in December. I think sepsis needs to be the next big thing up. We've had, in fairness, I think, we had tremendous success in reducing MRSA and C. diff rates, and I think sepsis needs to be the next big thing. But I think to answer your question directly, Ms. Gillen, I think often the reason it takes so long is because the system, rather than wanting to engage and understand exactly what happened, clams up and closes ranks. So someone like Scott Morris, who tragically lost his son Sam to sepsis, talks incredibly movingly about how he was told initially that this was an unavoidable death. His son was 3 years old. And only 6 months later did he think some things didn't feel right. And then he started talking to people, and the whole system closed rank. Not a single apology. Apart, in fact, from their GP, was the only person who apologised, but everyone else completely closed ranks. And it took him years. James Titcombe, who lost his son Joshua at Morecambe Bay, again, he's going to find out, he thinks, in the next few weeks when we publish the Morecambe Bay report, for a death that was in, I think, 2008. So the system, a system which should be really hungry to learn about what has gone wrong and inculcate it into practice, doesn't do that because there's a culture where people think they will get blamed for a mistake, when in fact what the culture should be is the only thing we'll blame you for is not telling the truth, so we can learn from mistakes. We recognise, even with deaths. Yesterday I had a difficult conversation with a relative, someone who'd lost his wife and son because of mistakes made by the NHS, about why it is you do have to be careful about naming and shaming, because if you do accountability in the wrong way, then no doctor or nurse will ever want to speak out about problems. And I think families do understand that. They all say, actually, all I want to do is to know that the NHS has learned from this tragedy.
Yeah, I mean, that takes us nicely on to accountability, because you've certainly acted to increase accountability across the whole of the NHS. Do you think there would be any benefit to having a no-fault compensation scheme for clinical incidents, like the one in New Zealand, for example?
I think it's... I know there are countries that do that. I think they do that in New Zealand. And, there are merits. I think there is a practical difficulty, which is because the vast majority of even serious incidents we don't pay any compensation for at all, because the vast majority of people aren't interested in money. If you were to automatically pay money for every single serious or severe incident, you would end up having to reduce the amounts you paid currently to the ones that we do pay money to, which might seem like a great injustice to the families involved. So I don't have a problem with the principle of it, but practically I think there may be some challenges.
I mean, accountability is such an important thing, and one of the most recent things that's happened is the announcement to hand Greater Manchester control of £6 billion of the NHS budget. Do you think that that is going to help increase accountability, or do you think it's going to add another layer to it? Because we've got this shadow health and wellbeing board. Is this really going to streamline and improve the service, or is it going to, this form of devolution, is it going to add complications to the system that you are trying to sort out?
I think it's important to understand what this announcement is, and in fairness, the details are going to be published later on in the week, so I'm afraid I can't go into too much detail today, but essentially, I will be responsible as Health Secretary for healthcare in Greater Manchester, just as I am in everyone's constituency around this table. That's not going to change. The accountability will still be with me and with NHS England, but what NHS England are saying is that in different parts of the country there will be a kind of organisation in the driving seat for making the big decisions about healthcare in that area that would then work with other bodies, but there needs to be someone in the driving seat. In some areas that could be the local authority, as in Greater Manchester. In other areas it could be a very go-ahead trust, a hospital. In other areas it could be some enterprising GPs. And we're not going to tell areas which it should be. Most areas it's fairly natural which it should be. But everyone, whoever you choose to be the kind of person in the driving seat, they'll all be accountable for the same outcomes in terms of national standards, A&E waiting times targets, elective care waiting times and so on. That won't change. And how well they do will be published, and if they don't deliver, we'll step in.
But it is adding a layer of complication, presumably.
I don't think it is. I would say it's actually it's creating simplicity, because what we're saying is that we need in every part of the country, if we're going to implement the changes in care that we need to deal with an ageing population, you need to have an organisation in the driving seat in each area. But we're open-minded as to who that organisation should be.
I'd like to come back to you on a record-keeping matter, but I think Mr. Mulholland wanted to...
Great. Is that on this question of accountability?
Yeah, Jeremy, we've had conversations about this in the past, and we have at a committee level. And do you understand that there is a concern that the changes in the health service over the last few years have actually made the NHS less accountable, precisely because at times people come to you, including me, including other members of the committee, and then the answer is, well, actually it's down to NHS England. And there's a sense actually that, the buck should stop with you as Secretary of State for Health, and then sometimes it doesn't, and actually you or your ministerial team will say, well, that's nothing to do with us and we can't get involved in that. So how do you square that circle?
Well, I think I am responsible for healthcare delivered to your constituents and everyone throughout the country, and the buck ultimately must stop with me and should stop with me and should always stop with the Health Secretary. I think there are times where it is helpful to have some distance from ministers, helpful for the public as well as for ministers. So, we have an independent, nice process which doesn't always work as fast as we want, but I think there are things where you need clinical expertise, and those things are at arm's length. And I think there was a very strong feeling in the NHS that where, for example, every single hospital reorganisation was being decided by a Secretary of State, they always became extremely political, and so things that really should be more operational decisions decided at a local level. The reforms introduced by my predecessor created some distance between the Secretary of State and those reforms, but I would say that I am responsible for the outcomes of everyone. So in the end, if what those reforms generate are outcomes that are worse than before, which I don't think they're doing, then that is my responsibility.
So you're clearly there accepting that the buck does stop with you still, which is constitutionally correct and welcome. But how do you actually deal with issues when it comes to NHS England, when it comes to the senior figures in NHS England? And without going over old ground, and I'm not going to reopen old disagreements, when I brought a complaint to you about senior NHS staff, you then repeated to me what they were telling you. Now, surely your role is to hold those people to account as well if there are issues with things that they've done, decisions they've taken, or issues within NHS England's failures, and there are failures by that body, as any other public body, as you very rightly and honestly admit. So, can we really rely on the Secretary of State, you, whoever your predecessor is, to make sure that they are ultimately responsible and they will take action if needed when there are failures even at the top of NHS England?
Well, I think in some ways the system we have at the moment makes accountability easier because, if you had the old structure where the Secretary of State was sitting at the top of a pyramid with direct command and control going right the way through the system, then the Secretary of State under that system would have taken advice from their officials and would have repeated that advice back to any MP that asked his or her opinion on any particular issue. We now have a structure where our requests to the NHS, what we're holding NHS England accountable for, are written in a 35-page document that didn't exist before, which is there for the public to see. This is what we are asking of NHS England. And if you're failing on that, we can hold them accountable for that. But I think we've also, with a new CQC regime, introduced an element of challenge into the system that didn't exist before because we have an independent chief executive. So just as any education sector, any government wants to say standards are going up and there are more good schools, well, when you have an independent Ofsted system, that creates some objectivity into the system, which is, I hope, what I've been able to introduce into the NHS.
Okay,
last question, Gregory.
Last question. On a very specific point, I've just come straight from the Rare Diseases Day reception. It's Rare Diseases Day, as you will know, on Saturday. Now, NHS England failed 180 children around the country with tuberous sclerosis, with Morquio disease, and with Duchenne muscular dystrophy. They had a process that was clearly discriminatory against people with ultra-rare diseases, which they had to scrap on receipt of a legal letter back in December. And precisely to give an example of how, I'm afraid, I don't think the accountability is working, all that those children and the organisations are being told with regards to that decision, which clearly was the fault of NHS England, is that the decision now is with NHS England. And yet really what should be happening is that you as Secretary of State should be instructing them to put an interim process in place to deal with their mistake, their moral and potentially legal responsibility to fund the drugs for those children, and it's not happening. So can I ask, will you convene that? Will you hold NHS England to account? And can we have an interim decision on that funding before Parliament dissolves?
Well, I will have to take that issue away and look into it. But the only thing I would say is that I'm not sure that that particular issue is an issue that would have happened any differently under previous structures. I mean, there is a, But
I mean, with respect, the body was actually, the replacement body was one, replacing one that was abolished by the Health and Social Care Act, so there's a direct political responsibility as well.
Yeah, but I think those difficult decisions about the funding of drugs for people with rare diseases are ones that happen under any structure, and the reality is that we don't have as much money as we would like to be able to fund the many rare diseases that there are.
Indeed, but will you hold them to account?
We do hold them to account.
And will you intervene? I'm asking you to intervene personally.
Well, I will look at the issue and I'll take it away, but and I'll write to you when I've had a chance to look at it.
Nigel Evans.
You've got one heck of a responsibility, Secretary of State. It literally is life and death. And you gave that analogy of the airline industry, which I thought was probably quite apposite, that you'd have to get on a plane every day for 10,000 years before you would ordinarily get involved in an incident. That clearly wasn't the case in the 1950s. So you clearly see what the problem is. but there are still huge issues within the NHS that the airline industry doesn't face. So what do you think that you can do to bring the NHS up to that standard?
I think the only thing you can do is to start the long journey of culture change, where people, the 1.3 million people who work in the NHS, feel that if they speak out with concerns or suggestions as to how to improve patient care and how to avoid the nearly 1,000 avoidable deaths we have every month, they will be listened to and supported, and that's part of their job. And I think, unfortunately, in too many places, the culture is the opposite of that. People think it's safer not to speak out than safer to speak out. And I was very struck when I've spoken to pilot friends, that if you're a pilot and you're involved in any kind of a near miss, the safest thing to do is to report it. The dangerous thing professionally is not to report it. To report it is safe. I went to what is sometimes thought to be the safest hospital in the world in Seattle. It's called Virginia Mason Hospital. They had an incident similar to the one that you talked about, Miss Gillan, where they, in 2004, injected cleaning fluid into someone's brain by accident because it was the same colour as the fluid that should have been injected, and this lady died an agonising death over 2 weeks, and that was the start of their journey. But when I went to see them early last year, they were celebrating because the first time in 1 month, their own staff, it's only a small hospital, their own staff had raised 800 safety concerns. This is the first time it's ever happened, and we're really proud of that. Now, I doubt that you would find a single hospital in the NHS that raises 800 safety concerns from staff in a whole year, let alone a whole month. Although we do have some very, very good hospitals which are blazing a trail on safety. So I think that culture where you're really valuing staff who speak out is the only way in the long run that you'll change it. And that's what I think we have to do.
Well, I totally agree with you.
Briefly.
Could you please therefore say how we're going to get that culture change?
Yes. Okay, well, there's quite a long list of things, but I'll just give you a sort of a random few. So we've changed the professional codes of doctors and nurses so that they get protection if they speak out, and it's much more explicit that they have a responsibility to speak out. We've made it a criminal offence for hospitals not to tell patients when they've harmed them or their families. We are looking at removing hospitals' immunity from litigation fees if they make a mistake but they haven't been honest with the family from the start. Under Mike Durkin's leadership, we've set up an initiative called Sign Up to Safety, which over 200 organisations have signed up to across the NHS, which is committed to halving avoidable harm and death over the next 3 years, saving potentially 6,000 lives. We've changed the inspection regime, which we've talked about, to put a much greater emphasis on safety. And then the last one, which I think will be, if it works, will be the most revolutionary of all, but we've got to do it, is we are aiming to be the first country in the world that publishes the number of avoidable deaths by hospital. So each hospital will know roughly how many avoidable deaths we estimate are happening at that hospital. And then they're going to be asked to write to me, or the Secretary of State, every year to say what they're doing to reduce the number of avoidable deaths. Now that is a very complex process and a difficult thing to do, but we're working on a methodology with Professor Sir Bruce Keogh, and he's, by the way, another amazingly inspiring person when it comes to safety.
Great. Thank you for that. I just want to bring you back to draw this together, because actually, whatever organisational arrangements you have, you are the individual ultimately responsible for safety in the NHS, and you've got to resolve that tension between accountability and responsibility and the no blame culture, because it's been said that to some extent in our system everybody becomes a victim, or everyone feels like a victim. The clinicians feel they are victims of this culture you're trying to promote, because everyone's going to be complaining. The patients feel they're victims because their complaints aren't heard. I can tell you, even the people at the Ombudsman Service sometimes feel they are victims because they're unable to resolve the complaints that have been raised. How can we promote this no blame culture without the safe space for this reporting, which we still lack?
It's a very, very difficult thing to do. So I think the only way that you can do it is essentially by going through two stages. The first stage is to be honest about the problems. And you have to start with that basic honesty. And I don't believe that we had that in the NHS. I think there was a culture built up over decades that basically, where there were problems, huge efforts were made to sweep them under the carpet, often on the grounds that it would destroy the confidence of the local population in their hospital if this got out that this terrible thing had happened, and so the best thing we can do is to quietly sort it out. And unless you're honest about problems, they don't get sorted out. And I think actually we've had dramatic improvements in the hospitals that we put into special measures, where we have been honest about the problems, and then we've actually galvanised action. So there's a pain barrier you go through, though, the first time you start to be open about problems. We went through it in the education system 20 years ago when we put schools into special measures under the new Ofsted regime, but it galvanised change, and we actually have got rid of the sync comprehensives that were a big feature of the education system throughout the 1980s and 90s as a result of that regime. And so that's it. Then I think the next stage is, and people of course are nervous, what will be the consequences of this honesty? And we need a system where they see, actually, there are no consequences for you if you help us to understand the mistakes and help us to fix them. So this isn't about naming and shaming. This is about learning how we can do things better. And you create that culture of continuous improvement, which you see in hospitals like Luton, which is a fantastically well-run hospital. You see it in Salford Royal. You see it in Buckinghamshire after they've come out of special measures. There's a great learning culture starting to develop there. There's actually Scotland, they've done some brilliant work on preventing avoidable deaths. So I'm just sort of looking around the table, and I think even in Colchester they're turning a corner. So you do see change happening in culture, but it does take time to filter down. Medical records.
Yes, can I just add to the protections? I hope you will include pharmacists in that, having had a constituency case with a very brave pharmacist. So I hope that their whistleblowing will be protected and they will be looked at. But yes, I just wanted to come back to you on medical records, because we've had evidence that there's often cases where medical records are inaccurate and incomplete, and they're very complicated, and you realise how much we rely on them to have good outcomes of our treatment in the NHS. What have you been doing to improve medical record keeping, and can you give us a reassurance that that is going to be on an upward trajectory?
Well, next month is a very important month in this respect, because for the first time we're going to give everyone the right to access their medical records online. So the first step to improving the accuracy of medical records is to allow the public to see their own record. And where this has happened in America, what they find is that patients come back to their hospitals and their doctors and say, "You've got this wrong." And you start correcting a lot of the mistakes in records, because obviously people know a lot more of the detail of what's happened to themselves than sometimes their doctors do. And so you start to get more accurate medical records. So that's, I think, going to be a first step. But I think actually medical records is also an indication of how the system has gone so badly wrong. Because I'm afraid we have had cases where there have been tragedies, and the first reaction of staff has been to destroy the medical records. And that is, an indication of how the culture is wrong and how it needs to change, because the staff should not be afraid of someone, if there's a tragedy, actually trying to understand. In fact, they should think it's their responsibility to try and understand how things went wrong, and that they'll be supported on that journey. But I'm afraid that shows that there is still a culture of fear when there shouldn't be, and that's what we have to tackle.
Thank you very much. Moving on, Kelvin Hopkins.
Yes, you mentioned the difficulties, and appreciate those, and I can think of all sorts of reasons. Professional reputation, hierarchies, nurses criticising consultants, and so on. All sorts of, and also costs. I mean, there are cost pressures on hospitals, and if they think, well, if they raise this issue, it's going to cost us more money. It's going to be more difficult. But can I ask, where in the current system might there be greater capacity for investigating serious incidents and disseminating lessons learned? I mean, you talk about the difficulties. Well, where can things be improved? And who's currently responsible for trying to get these improvements?
Well, it's Mike Durkin's safety function at NHS England. I think that is the best place to do it. Mike himself has an extraordinary track record in this area, but I think that would be the place which I think the responsibility it does sit, and we need to support it to do its job even better.
And I understand that you've been resistant, the government's been resistant to the idea of establishing a single independent body. We've heard persuasive evidence that would be a very good idea, a single independent body to carry out these investigatory functions.
I wouldn't say that we are resisting it, but I'd say that we are resisting the idea that every incident should be investigated by a single body, just because the scale, to investigate 250,000 deaths, I think, to be honest, you'd end up with all the doctors investigating deaths, and they wouldn't actually be able to operate on patients if you were kind of going to do this. It was such a huge thing compared to the 50 investigations every year that the Air Accident Investigation Branch does. But I think there might be a role for an independent investigations branch that was available for NHS trusts to use if they wanted a swift, independent view of what had gone wrong, possibly available for the Ombudsman to use in certain situations. I think that is something that we could look at. I think the natural place for that to sit would be in Mike Durkin's.
We understand there's something of a difference of view or a division of view on this. NHS England tell us that they are already working on creating a patient safety investigation branch, but your department rejects the idea of a new body. Could you elaborate a bit on those tensions and the difference of view?
Yes, I don't think they are quite as different in substance. I mean, the specific idea that we responded to in the department's evidence were the idea of a single clinical investigation branch based at the Department of Health that would be responsible for looking into all serious incidents. And I don't think that's logistically feasible, and I don't think the Department of Health is the right place for it to sit. But I think, hospitals do a lot of local investigations very satisfactorily and well, and we should allow them to continue to do that, because I think it is important there's local responsibility for safety records. But I think there may be something to be said for having a central function of the scale of the Air Accident Investigation Branch for cases where there's a dispute or where there's a lack of trust or where the relationship has broken down, and where you need a rapid expert view.
In a previous evidence session, it was pointed out, suggested, of course, there is a significant difference between aviation accidents and health accidents, because in aviation, if things go wrong, the pilot dies too, and so they've got a vested interest, a very strong vested interest, in making sure that everything works perfectly. And I'm not suggesting that surgeons would be more casual, but on the other hand, they don't die if something goes wrong with the patient. You mentioned Luton and Dunstable Hospital, which is a fine hospital, and I've been treated by it myself in the last couple of years, and they've done a superb job. However, even at Luton, problems arise, and constituents come to me. I'm sure they go to other members as well. Problems I have to take up with the hospital. If there was an independent body, I could refer these to that independent body. Might be a very brief investigation, in fact. But I have this uncomfortable situation where a hospital which I admire and treats me, I have to, in a sense, raise issues with the chief executive. And sometimes these go on because they're defensive at first, and eventually you get some kind of resolution, but it's sometimes very difficult and very awkward. And I don't want to be critical of people I know and care about, staff members I know the trade unionists and so on. It is very uncomfortable. If I could just refer it to another body to investigate, that would solve all those problems. But actually what happens at the moment, and things go really seriously wrong, particularly for constituents who haven't got any money, can't afford to go and employ lawyers and so on, they come to their MP, and then I have this uncomfortable situation, not being able to make clinical judgments myself, because I'm not a medic, although very intelligent amateur in these matters. But another body would be very helpful.
Yes, I think there is a logistical challenge because the average hospital will have between 600 and 1,500 deaths every year, and if everyone had the option of getting an independent investigation, people, we would have huge numbers of investigations going on the whole time, which would actually suck up huge amounts of medical manpower that we don't have. And so I think there is a scale issue, but I think there may be a role for a clinical investigation branch in Mike Durkin's safety function at NHS England, that in particular situations that are perhaps filtered, if you look at the Ombudsman's inquiries, they have to filter the number of inquiries they can do. They can't investigate absolutely every single one that they're asked to do, and there may be a benefit, and I think it might be something that trusts welcome, because if it offered a service that trusts don't currently have, which is the chance for a speedy, expert investigation into an incident that gets to the truth quickly on a no-blame basis, that I think might be something, I think of Morecambe Bay and the families there, where there was a clear breakdown in trust between the trust and the families. That would have been a way that would have meant they didn't have to have this Kirkup inquiry that is happening so many years after they've suffered those tragedies. So I think there could be a role there.
And just one more question. We've heard that a lot of bodies involved in investigation at the moment. There's quite a sort of jungle of organisations in some ways. Wouldn't better coordination between these existing bodies be one way of improving the performance of the NHS on investigations? And if they were to be coordinated, who should lead this coordination?
Well, I think Mike Durkin's safety function is the central place where all the learning should be assembled and disseminated. And I think that is, that safety function is an incredibly important part of the whole system. And then I think that's the supportive bit, if you like, which is trying to help people who want to improve their safety record. I think you do also then need someone completely independent who is actually going around calling a spade, saying, yes, this hospital's safe, no, we're not satisfied with the safety in this hospital. And that needs to be separate and independent, and that would be the Chief Inspector of Hospitals.
Just to follow up, I hear you laying great emphasis on Mike Durkin and his proposed patient safety investigation branch. But there would need to be three elements added to his capability. One is complete independence, and that includes independence from NHS England. How would you provide that?
I don't think he would need that. I think the desire of clinicians.
NHS England is a major commissioning body in the NHS. It might be looking at systemic problems that lead to patient safety issues. It might be itself a contributor, and therefore as conflicted as you say you are.
Well, their submission actually says that they're not necessarily wedded to the idea that unit should always sit in NHS England, and I think that's something that one could give further thought to. And
also, we're not getting an answer today, but I understand that we're just exploring the issues, and I acknowledge that you recognise the issue the question raises. Also, it needs to be able to offer legal immunity to people who are. This is the AAIB case, that people who go and talk to the air accident people, they are legally immune. Those words they use to explain what's happened cannot be used in court against them. Do you accept that that's part of the no-blame culture that we need?
I think that could well be a part of the new clinical investigation branch if we go down that route. I think it's also important to say that even the AIB doesn't maintain secrecy or immunity if they discover that someone has broken the law.
So, but it can't be FOI'd, for example.
No, but they have. So there is gross. So pilots aren't immune from gross negligence or willful negligence, and nor are doctors. And we have a.
It doesn't protect people from wrongdoing.
No.
But it does protect. It does give people freedom to
speak. It does make people give people confidence that if they speak out, confidences will be respected.
Moving on. Learning from NHS complaints. Greg.
Thank you, Chair. Jeremy, I'm keen to talk to you about the Ombudsman. It's a big issue for this committee. We obviously have oversight of the Parliamentary and Health Service Ombudsman and have had a lot to say about it, and I'm sure that you're aware of our position on it and our call for a radical overhaul of the system. I mean, just in terms specifically with the role that the Ombudsman has currently with regards to clinical incidents, clinical failures, can I ask, do you actually think that that's an appropriate role for the Parliamentary and Health Service Ombudsman? There's been some criticism about the lack of expertise. Do you think that is something the Ombudsman, certainly in its current form, should be doing?
I do. I don't think that I think it's perfectly possible. They have clinical experts who they draw on when they do their investigations, and they are investigating. They've agreed to investigate many more incidents following the Francis report into mid-staffs than they were previously investigating, and they need to make sure that they have the expertise to do that. I think it is possible if we had a clinical investigations branch that they could work in partnership with the Ombudsman, and there may be times when the Ombudsman says, actually, could you do this investigation for us, because we think this is one way you can get to the bottom of what happened more quickly, and that could be something that we could look at. But I think to be very direct, I think the concerns that people have had about the Ombudsman haven't so much been about the expertise, but about that culture of openness and transparency. When the Ombudsman itself has made a mistake, I think part of that transparency and openness and the way that they would reassure people is if people felt that they were open in that way too. And I don't want to make a judgment as to whether that happened or not, but I just relate the sort of feedback you get from some of the families, and they have had those concerns. I know that Dame Julie is very aware of those and very keen to do something about that.
On the basis that you do think it's an appropriate function for the current Ombudsman to be involved in, how do you square that with your unprecedented, very public criticism, that something that this committee wrote to you about, which was potentially breaking protocol when you publicly criticised the Ombudsman for their failure that you raised in writing to them?
Well, I'm not responsible for the Ombudsman, and I hope I made it very clear in my letter that I don't see myself as responsible for the Ombudsman. It's responsible for you. So therefore, I had to find a way of trying to make sure, in terms of my responsibility for patients, that some of the concerns that I was hearing would get addressed. That's a slightly unusual thing for a government minister to be in the position, if you like, as a campaigner trying to get change. But my view was that I needed to say something publicly if this issue was going to be addressed, because I was hearing it from more than one source, and I was very concerned that the changes that we were trying to make in culture and the rest of the NHS, which we've been discussing this afternoon, weren't happening at the pace they needed to in the Ombudsman, and that was despite trying quite hard in private, trying to get these changes to happen. So that was why I did that.
Well, I think there are different views as to whether it was appropriate or not for you to do that. Clearly, as a Secretary of State for the Department of Health, and of course, therefore, you are accountable, and the Department of Health is accountable to the Ombudsman. But can I ask you, really, as a senior member of the government, rather than in your role as Secretary of State for Health, why is the government so resistant to what we have proposed as a committee, which is for the radical overhaul of the Ombudsman system that we believe, and that so many people in the country now passionately believe needs to happen. We've written to the government, not to you on this particular point, but we've just hit a brick wall. You're not prepared today to say that you share our view that we should have a radical overhaul of the Ombudsman system to make it fit for purpose for the health service, but for the public sector as a whole?
I'm not sure why you don't just overhaul it then, because it's your responsibility, it's not mine.
This is a ludicrous thing. It is down to the government. It's supposed to be the parliamentary and health service ombudsman, but the government are blocking it. The government have refused to do anything about it, and that's a fact.
Well, I will look at your report.
I think it's slightly unfair to say the government are blocking it.
They've refused to do.
We're waiting for a comprehensive response to our report, our two reports on complaints and on the Ombudsman.
And we have 5 weeks left.
Yes, but I want to see your report on this. I would certainly champion any changes to legislation if they were going to improve patient safety.
Can I be a little bit cheeky then and say, obviously there's 5 weeks left, no chance of legislation to reform the Ombudsman service. Is this something, if you find yourself in government or not in the next Parliament, that you would support?
I would absolutely support, if there was legislation that was necessary to improve the way the Ombudsman worked and that led to better support for patients where things have gone wrong, then I would absolutely support that.
And we are hoping that the response will be clear about that, and so that whoever wins the election will take on the responsibility of bringing forward that legislation. We're very clear about that.
Yeah. Thank you. I mean, that's a positive response.
To which Secretary of State, by the way, does your...
It's with Oliver Letwin in the Cabinet Office.
Right.
So thank you for that positive. And just really to give you a sense of what we believe that could mean for the health service complaints, which are a particular issue, and that's no doubt why you yourself raised it. I think what we see is a citizens ombudsman service that would be something that could be accessed directly by people about any public service at all, and then there would be specialisms within it, and indeed that the Ombudsman service would then work with other complaints bodies if they were the appropriate one, but it would become the place to go to. So because of the level of concern that there is, and there is about NHS complaints in particular, do you think that there is a potential model there that could assist some of the things and could help deal with these problems that we all have with NHS complaints?
We have to get a whole lot better at the way we deal with complaints in the NHS, and I would need to reflect on the detail of what your proposals are. But we haven't really talked much about complaints, and I'll just make one brief point about complaints. I think that the issue with complaints is exactly the same as the issue with investigations, which is what is the learning that happens as a result of the process. And I think in too many parts of the NHS, complaints handling is a process. It's a function of a part of trust, because we need to reply to these letters. And so one of the things that Mike Richards is doing as part of his inspections is explicitly looking for evidence that hospitals are learning from the complaints they receive and making changes as a result of the letters written by members of the public who've used their services. And I think that's part of that culture change.
You've actually preempted my final question there, which was about what information is centrally gathered to learn from mistakes throughout the NHS, which I think you've just basically explained. But so there is a real move to try to have lessons learned from complaints from all sections of the health service that's brought together centrally to try to improve things.
Yes, I mean, I don't think there's a shortage in terms of the data we collect. I think that there's not enough hunger to learn from that data. And I think there's also a lot of under-reporting of problems. So one of the things that we've done is a report, which actually Mike Durkin helped me to put together, which is a table which we publish, which actually says whether trusts have an open and honest reporting culture. And they concluded around 20% of the trusts in the country don't have an open and honest reporting culture. And so I hope that will prompt some change.
Sheila Gilmore.
Yeah, I mean, one of the things that a lot of ordinary people find in complaints procedures is that they are incredibly mechanistic, and what they get back is So, well, this was our stage 1 process, we're now going to pass you on to stage 2, we're going to pass you on to... It doesn't seem very person-centred at all, but the organisation has ticked the box of having a procedure. So are you looking at that aspect of things?
Yes. In fact, we're following the recommendations made by Anne Clwyd, who did some excellent work on how we could improve complaints procedures with Professor Tricia Hart. And it shouldn't be mechanistic. I mean, I'll give you the best example I've seen of NHS complaints is actually my local hospital, Frimley Park in Camberley. I went to see the Chief Executive as a sort of regular visit and raised 3 complaints that I'd had from constituents. And he said, yes, that one we made a mistake. We didn't have enough staff on that night. This one we also made another mistake. And this one I hadn't heard about, but I'll look into that. But complete openness. That is the first hospital in the country to be given a CQC outstanding. And I was very encouraged by that because basically I know that it's run by someone who is very open and very hungry to learn from every mistake that's made in his trust. And that's how you get the highest standards.
So when we started down the question of complaints, we found that a survey conducted by the Ombudsman found that very few boards actually looked at complaints, and that culture has already changed very dramatically. They now tend to look at complaints as a source of learning for the board about what's happening in the organisation.
Well, I try to read one complaint every day from a member of the public. It's the first thing I do when I get into work, to try and remind myself of some of the problems, and I do find that shapes my day.
How did officials react when you told them you wanted to do that?
I think with quite a degree of surprise and quite a degree of concern, but I think they, Department of Health officials have been on this journey just like the NHS is going on this journey. So in the last 2 years they have set up something called the Connecting Programme, where every official in the Department of Health will, we've done it now with the most senior and we're rolling it out to everyone, will spend 4 weeks every year on the front line, volunteering, understanding what's happening on the front line as part of that, making sure that we learn the lessons of mid-staffs, where people in Whitehall had absolutely no idea what was going on in a remote corner of the NHS. So we're trying to build much stronger connections.
Sheila, had you finished?
When we go, often we get a very different response. I mean, I know I do from the DWP, my local benefits office. How can you be sure that from that sort of individual who's getting these, say, very formalistic letters, that it's really happening? Because, if I go and speak to a chief executive or the whatever, is that really the response that ordinary people are getting?
Well, no, I know it's true. I sort of was warned that if I go and visit a hospital, there's a high risk that the ward I'm visiting might be repainted before my arrival. And so, this is a real problem. But, I think in the end, that's why it's not what we find out, it's what our constituents, the way they're treated that matters. And of course what we all see as MPs is we see the letter that the constituent got back, that they then show us and say, was this satisfactory? But I would just like to say, I think, it's important to have a degree of optimism in this, and because I think that although it's a very big challenge, I have noticed that when I started talking about the safety agenda, and I think I've been more interested in it than previous Secretary of State simply because I had to deal with mid-staffs as the first thing that I did. I find you're pushing at an open door in the NHS. I mean, I find that doctors and nurses are really interested and really enthusiastic, and they want to do this. This is not something, when you start to talk to people, that they say this is a waste of time and this is health and safety, or this is procedures. They are really interested and enthusiastic, and what they want to do is no one wants to be in a system that's making mistakes. So if you say to people, how can we build a system that doesn't make mistakes, people cooperate, they're supportive, and you can get that right culture. So I think if we carry on this agenda, we really can be the first country in the world that cracks this, and I think that would just be something we could all be very proud of.
We must end, but just very briefly on the complaints issue. What was your reaction to the Witch campaign, which uncovered quite a widespread fear of people in hospitals scared of raising a complaint because they felt that it would affect their treatment.
Yes, that is. I mean, I think that is an indication of where the culture needs to change. I think there is, there are definitely people who don't complain as much as they should, and I think where that was at its worst was in Mid-Staffs. Julie Bailey, who's one of the main campaigners there, she in her book she writes very movingly of how her mother, who was treated appallingly badly, begged her not to raise any complaints with the staff. And in fact, there was a particular nurse who really treated her mother badly, who her mother insisted that she bought a Christmas present for, because she was in hospital over Christmas. And she said, I couldn't believe this, but my mother was just so frightened of this nurse that it... So,
can I give you another example of a GP friend of mine whose relative is being treated for cancer and was given an intravenous fluid for overnight, but was given far more than the prescribed dose by accident, so that he nearly drowned in the fluid. He didn't die. He refused to raise a complaint about it. So his GP relative felt that she was unable to raise a complaint about it because he didn't want to complain. And it does seem to me that incidents of that nature, there should be a system for simply making sure that an incident of that nature is dealt with.
Yes. But the only thing I would say is that the responsibility is as much on the chief executive and the board of a trust to change that culture as the individual doctor or nurse. Because I think the doctors or nurses feel, if they feel that they're going to get into trouble if someone raises a complaint, then they will discourage that process. And so the signals that they get are as important as the signals they give to their own patients.
But how do you reconcile that with the fact that administrators feel perhaps historically more beholden and accountable for financial outturns than clinical outturns?
Everyone has to be accountable to patients first and foremost.
Just on that point. Okay, very briefly.
One of the problems is the excessive use of agency staff, agency nurses. If the nurse is attached to a ward on a long-term basis and there's a sense of esprit de corps amongst the team, you're going to get better treatment than having people drifting in and out of hospital one day, another hospital another, having no sense of responsibility to their hospital. Just reducing the level of agency nursing would make a difference.
I totally agree. I think we've had a temporary spike in agency staff because post-Mid-Staffs I asked every trust to count the number of nurses on every ward and publish it online so that we can all see it every month to make sure that we were dealing with the issue of short-staffed wards. And so as a reaction to that, trust thought, actually let's get in staff quickly because I don't want to be short-staffing my wards. And so the only way they could get staff quickly was through agencies. But I hope it will be a temporary bulge because I completely agree with you. For continuity of care and for making sure you have proper training and proper procedures, you need to have regular full-time staff.
And just very briefly on the PHSO. PHSO has obviously got a very important role to play in this whole, at the apex of the complaint structure and related to clinical investigation. But the patient lying in the ward who's got a complaint, the PHSO is far too far away, both physically and in time, to deal with that complaint. You recognise that?
Yes.
And so this question of, there have been periods when the PHSO did not have responsibility for clinical investigations at all. What do you think about that?
Well, I think the first thing is to create a culture where people feel that they can complain to the local trust and be listened to, and it should never get near the PHSO in that situation. So I think the first thing is to make sure we have the right culture at the local level, so that in that ward someone can raise a complaint and it's dealt with quickly, and that's the heart of it. I mean, when we're having to deal with complaints to the PHSO or whistleblowers or clinical investigations done by external bodies, that's a sign of failure when all those things have to happen. But I do think that in extremis, you might find there's someone you need to go to outside the hospital. And so that's why there is a role for the PHSO in those situations.
But in terms of the no-blame culture, PHSO is about delivering redress for a complaint. So can PHSO is the PHSO the best person to be the apex of a no-blame investigation process?
I think we need to make sure that we have the structures in place so that we have a continuous improvement culture and a learning culture anyway, irrespective of the PHSO. But sometimes there is a situation when someone simply needs to adjudicate, is it the trust in the wrong or is it the patient in the wrong? And some of the disputes that happen are very personal, with very strong grievances and very strong emotions. And sometimes, and I think patients do need a system where in the end someone makes a judgment as to which side was right and which side was wrong, which you won't always get if you simply are looking to improve clinical practice by identifying things that have gone wrong. So I think there is a role for the PHSO.
And finally, this new openness of culture and this promotion of encouraging people to report incidents and complaints is seeing a big caseload increase for PHSO. Would you rather spend some of your budget on increasing the capacity of PHSO or on increasing your own capacity in the health service and in your department, so that these complaints are dealt with long before they need to go to PHSO? Which would you prefer?
Well, I actually think it's not either or. We probably need to do both, because basically in the end we need to make it easier for people to complain. We need to accept that we make it easier for staff to report incidents. We need to have better processes for dealing with complaints and for staff-reported safety alerts, and make sure that there's learning that happens from all of those. And actually that's how you reduce the 2 billion cost of mistakes that happen in the NHS every year. So I think it's a false economy not to learn from our mistakes, and I think it's something we need to do much better.
I think we're done. You've been with us for a long time and we're very grateful to you for that and for your openness and candour. You practice what you preach. Is there anything you want to add?
I think the parliamentary system is equally punishing of mistakes. I think it's incredibly difficult for ministers to admit they ever make a mistake, because they know that they'll be on the floor of the House of Commons and be utterly castigated for it. And I think there's nothing we can do about that. I wouldn't want to change the way our democracy works, except that I think that possibly as parliamentarians there are times when we should accept when ministers are honest about things that they've done wrong and not immediately seek to make party political capital, because I think that is part of the way that will create more openness throughout the whole system. So I think part of the defensiveness throughout the NHS may come from defensiveness by ministers, and that culture feeds its way down. And I just don't have an obvious solution to that, but I just make the observation.
I think that's a very strong point, and if I may say so, I hope the way we conduct this committee reflects some of your feeling on that question. Cheryl Gillan?
Can I, having been in your position as the Secretary of State, agree with you entirely? Because I think that there are so many instances where it's much better to work cross-party and in an atmosphere of calm rather than the hostility that we get. And I hope you would agree with me that you would like to see more cross-party working on issues that we need to pursue in the interests of our citizens, rather than what we've just seen recently in terms of statements like weaponising the NHS, which I regret terribly.
Well, let me just not be controversial and say that I think that this agenda is something that can be shared across all parties. There's absolutely no reason why it couldn't be. And indeed, I think the way that you've conducted certainly this hearing, which is the first time I've spoken to a committee, is exemplary in that respect, because we've had a pretty open discussion.
I'm very much aided by opposition members of Parliament who have not sought to politicise this in any way, and I'm very grateful to them. Thank you very much indeed, Secretary.
Thank you.
Order.